This is a link to the slides. It's not a Rickroll. I guess you want to scan it? You want to scan it? No? No, okay. Okay, this is a short talk about using Perl at an established company, including the issues and challenges around that, and of course the good stuff as well. So I gave this talk at FOSDEM back in February, so I'll kind of give it from that point of view in a way, which will make sense. Okay, about me. Normally I don't do this, but when I was at FOSDEM, there was lots of people that I didn't recognize, so I assume they didn't recognize me. So I'm a senior dev, head of processing at PayProb since 11 years now, almost. I'll get into that shortly. I've been a developer for 20 years. I've worked with various languages, but most often Perl. I've only worked for 3 companies in that time, so I've kind of seen tech stacks grow or shrink as appropriate. I'm a CPAN contributor, so I'm Legio on CPAN. London and Swiss Perl workshop organizer, so come and talk to me if you're interested in either of those. A regular speaker at other Perl workshops and conferences, usually helping out with recordings. Occasionally blog about Perl, but I prefer to write long-form articles rather than short technical posts. I run the Perl Events Instagram account, which is about the limit of my social media interaction, though. And a FOSDEM newbie, well, no longer a FOSDEM newbie. Our work event always clashed. We have a work event at the end of January, which is generally when FOSDEM happens, so I never got to go until this year. Okay, about PayProb. So we are a payment and reconciliation platform for the residential lettings industry. And we turn things like this into things that users can actually work with. So this is a Swift payment file. We put nice interfaces on it and allow agencies to reconcile their payments, literally saving them days, if not weeks of work, so they can focus on other parts of their business. And the keen-eyed of you, very keen-eyed of you, will see CGI bin in that URL. So yeah, we've been around for 20 years. In fact, 20 years this year, actually. So we have some old code, bit of an understatement. We don't have an old Perl, though, so we're running on, at the moment, 5.32, which is now, what, 4 years? 4 years old, so yeah, it's getting to the point where we should get a more recent version. We could do special things with it, compile it with special flags. We don't, we just build our own, so we have full control over what's installed where, rather than relying on the system Perl or whatever. Not the system Perl. So we're not kind of tied to any particular version of an operating system. We can apply security patches and updates as necessary. When I gave this talk in FOSDEM, I think literally 3 days before the conference, there was a critical CVE against a couple of the spreadsheet parsing modules on CPAN, so we dropped the updates in there quickly, because we have dependency control, which is obviously critical. But one of the key things is loose coupling, so upgrades are much easier and safer if we're not relying on a system-provided version of Perl or the modules or whatever. And it's everywhere, which is key. So dev, CI, staging, demo, prod, same version of Perl, same range of libraries, makes debugging much easier. And the issues and challenges around that, well, I'm sure you've heard these. You still use Perl? Or even what is Perl? And now, increasingly, the bus factor. Things are falling out of maintenance, modules not being maintained for a long time. So yeah, it's a 20-year-old app, so it has some legacy, to say the least. We are in the process of converting from CGI.pm to Mojolicious. It's an ongoing task, about 2/3 complete in terms of number of requests to the site. So after 20 years, you can imagine we have lots of pages and lots of features and lots of routes, and really only 10% of those are really used. We have a long tail of these things that probably don't get used these days. So we've focused on the most commonly requested pages and have converted about 2/3 of those. We thought about doing that via this plugin. we used to have another app, and we use this plugin, but we don't do that for PayProb. We route it at the Apache level. So if it's CGI bin, it gets exec'd by Apache. If it's not, it gets routed to the downstream Mojolicious server. Basically that. I actually gave a previous talk about this, but this was a decade ago now, and things move on. So if you're interested, you can see that presentation. I don't think there's a recording. Some of it still applies, some of it doesn't. Because Mojolicious moves fast, and they don't really do backwards compatibility. So in the docs, they say you can always count on backwards compatibility, but they will deprecate and remove features within a 3-month window, which is the exact opposite of backwards compatibility. So, whoop, don't want to do that. Oh yeah, and the commit messages are rather poor in the repo. So often when we upgrade, there's been something deprecated or removed, and we have to figure that out. Run a git bisect, and then we get a commit messages like fix bug, which is like, which bug? It's not helpful. We have been adding an ORM. And I say this can be a contentious issue because of some of the stuff I read on social media, Hacker News, Reddit. I'm just kind of tired of writing stuff like this. You know, this is like the simplest way you can prepare an SQL statement and query the DB and check your error handling, and I don't want to do all that. I just want to be more, you know, descriptive. Find a property in the database with this ID and give me an object I can call methods on. I just prefer not to code all the stuff we can get for free, basically. And if we want to drop down to vanilla SQL, we can still do that for some of the hairier reporting queries. And the ORM kind of allows us to address and hide some of the legacy issues, because again, 20-year-old application, a schema that's come from the MySQL MyISM days with no foreign keys, and you get all of this stuff that you probably wouldn't write it that way these days. This was a comment on Hacker News when I said we use an ORM. I said, just fix your underlying schema. You know, things will break, but good, that's good, you might see it, and we're not going to risk the business on meeting an ideal, you know. And we could abstract that into our own libraries, but then you end up with a half-done ORM. You know, why you would not use one that's battle-tested, basically. So we use DBIx class. It's very feature-rich, very flexible, and not dogmatic about the way you use it. Issues around that: learning curve, the DSL of DBIx class. You need to learn it. It's quite big. It's currently unmaintained in the sense that they are very conservative about new releases because it's very widely used across many different database engines, so they're very conservative about making changes. And I did give a previous talk, a 50-minute talk I think it was, about using DBIx with a legacy schema, how you can address some of the issues that I note at the top there, and how you can use some of its syntax and DSL to make it easier to work with that legacy schema. So we're starting to use business objects or a model. The older code is CGI code, and it's kind of a procedural mashup of business logic, database access, view logic, all smushed into the same layer, which is difficult to test, difficult for the front-end devs. We're factoring newer code into business objects. And the note here is that the business objects are our model. The ORM is not our model. People often conflate the two. They're not the same thing. You have this templates, you know, the view, you have your controllers, then you have your business model, then you have the ORM. And the reason we're using objects to get all of this useful stuff, don't need to go into it too much. This is kind of OO done properly. It's not just creating an instance of a class and calling a method or calling methods. You get all of this good stuff if you're doing proper OO coding. And we're using Moose. Maybe we'll get to Karina eventually if we upgrade to Fernando's putting his thumbs up. Once it's more feature-rich in the core, it's missing a few things at the moment. We heavily do composition, so roles. And just to give an example, so we have this incoming payment class, and we have attributes that are other objects, and we can use proper type constraints to make sure that anything you put into it is what it should be, and it has an ID, and this is all just stuff that is really useful for easier debugging, better logging and tracing, and checking stuff is correct before you start to call methods on it, like this fail payment method. Can it be failed? No, throw an exception. If not, fail the underlying thing. Tell, don't ask. OO done properly, basically. So yeah, Moose, issues and challenges. Again, a learning curve. I think the learning curve is worth it. Moose is, I think, one of the best object systems available across any language, period. You add them up, and it becomes even more powerful. The introspection that's available in Perl is one of its strengths. There's been multi-day courses at Perl conferences in the past dedicated to Moose, so it's impossible for me to even scratch the surface here. Slow startup is not as much of an issue these days. The hardware is kind of caught up. It depends on your use case. So we do use some of these business model objects from the CGI scripts, but we tend to lazy load them. And they're in use in pages that would take a second or two to return their data anyway. So the difference of compiling whatever is, it's like 5% of the runtime, 2% of the runtime. It doesn't make that much difference. Unmutable state, yeah, that's my technical debt. That's one of the lessons you learn when you start writing proper OO code. You shouldn't have mutable objects because you get interesting bugs. Okay, we're trying to add a lot more testing. When I arrived 11 years ago, the testing was missing, basically. But it's kind of stuff beyond the unit and integration testing, which is kind of the easy stuff, depending on your code base. So we're taking the approach of all new code and any existing code that we're going to fix or refactor, we make sure there's test coverage there first, which can slow you down, but it pays dividends in the long run, I think. So yeah, we've got these critical business scripts that have existed forever, and they literally run the company. That's where all the money moves. We want minimal risk when we're updating them, but they don't have test coverage. So it's that bootstrapping problem of how do I fix it to get to a more easy to work with state so I can add test coverage, but there's no test coverage to allow me to get there. It's kind of that bootstrapping problem. But this is Perl. So we've come up with a framework that allows us to test some of these scripts in a way that we can add test coverage without making any changes to the scripts themselves. So we're kind of using some of Perl's compile time, runtime, state blocks to add test coverage. I'm not going to go into this too much, just to let you know that it does exist, and it is actually quite easy. So we have this override library that here is overriding the file slipper read text method and returning what we need. So when we run the script with this override library, we override read text, we can test what the script is expecting, then we can start to make changes. This is a talk by Nicholas Clark. It's a 45-minute talk going on to an hour, which goes into the details of how you do this. So I'd encourage you to watch this talk if you're interested, because there's a lot of ways you can do this. And one of the things it does is it introduces more technical debt in the short term. So it's a means to an end, basically. You get this load order in action at a distance, and you end up debugging the tests initially. The aim is you write these tests, you refactor the code, adding more unit tests, and then you throw away the initial tests. So we actively encourage contributions to CPAN. So these are all the distributions I've written in the last decade I've been at the company. It's quite small there, but you can see there's quite a few. but it's stuff like Mojolicious plugins, so plugin NYTPROF, plugin to do all of the OAuth 2 stuff, which is fun. Third-party libraries. So these are some of the payment service providers we use, and I've written libraries to interact with them. These are more kind of a UK-based set of payment service providers. I think GoCardless are opening up in the US recently. And other stuff like we maintain CGI.pm, we fork and update unmaintained API libraries, like there's a Google Maps, HTML Google Maps library that we've maintained now. Issues and challenges around that. Yeah, the pool of contributors to CPAN is shrinking. Solution, we volunteer to maintain existing libraries and to contribute stuff. Newer services and APIs generally don't provide a Perl library. You know, they'll give you a Go, a Ruby, a Python, a JavaScript, but then Perl, it's like, nah, not interested. But most modern services are written using RESTful APIs, and they're actually pretty easy to interact with. I mean, you can thrash through a pretty comprehensive library in a week, and the company I work for allows us to do that. So, you know, throw me at it, and we have a Perl library in a week or two. Navigating around IP issues, well, this is actually quite good because it encourages to properly decouple our code from our business logic to the third party's logic. So that's actually quite a good thing. And we hire devs new to Perl, so we've been hiring juniors, not recently, but in the last 5 years we've taken on, I want to say, in the region of 8 to 10 new juniors, new to Perl, some of them out of boot camp, some of them out of uni, never programmed in Perl or even knew about Perl. And I think the issue here is, yeah, Perl has been on the plateau of productivity for quite a while. Ovid kind of mentioned this in his talk. Those that left it a long time ago don't know the current ecosystem, and they tend to drudge up some of the stereotypes from 20 years ago when there's a thread on Reddit or Hacker News, like, I used to write in Perl. It's like, yeah, you don't know the current ecosystem, so your opinion's not as valid as it used to be. Because we're more than a generation removed from, you know, even Perl 5, when I'm talking about people getting jobs. Perl 1 was released 37 years ago, Perl 5, 30 years ago, 5.10, 17 years ago. I picked 5.10 because it was kind of like the modern Perl movement, basically. And Perl is still in a lot of places, and some of those places the users can't talk about it in a public forum like this, like the banks and the FANGs. I won't say which letter in the FANG, but I know for a fact some of them are using Perl. You know, if you're working for a company that won't let you talk about Perl, or if you've simply never thought about doing it, maybe ask your company if you can talk about Perl. I think the rumors of Perl's demise are greatly exaggerated, but it's kind of a known unknown at this point. We just need more people to speak up. And it's still being used for greenfield projects. So when I gave this talk at FOSDEM, they were live streaming and uploading every talk that weekend, which was close to 1,000 talks. And every single talk went through a modern Perl system. This is the largest open source conference in Europe. Nobody talks about that. It's only because I was interested in their video system I found that out. I think its popularity has kind of normalized over the last 2 decades. I hate to cite it because their methodology is a little bit poor, but you know, the TOB index shows a trend of all programming languages approaching a homogenized state. Everything is going down into a tail, apart from maybe Java and C. Everything else is kind of doing that. And it's kind of probably a good thing, because monoculture should be avoided, I think. So it's kind of hard to find Perl developers, but I'm finding that newcomers don't have preconceptions. At least that's my experience in interviewing. Generally those under 30 haven't heard of the language, or they haven't used it. And those who don't want to use the language self-select out of the hiring process anyway. Because we're explicit in jobs that we use Perl, we just don't have a requirement that we want somebody to know Perl unless we're looking for a senior Perl developer. And yeah, I think modern Perl is actually an interesting and enjoyable language to work with. And working with legacy code is a reality. It's not unique to Perl. And we do all of this stuff, and you should be doing all of this stuff. It's essential if you have newcomers to the language, especially for Perl. The web is full of a lot of out-of-date advice and examples. And the problem with a lot of the approach now of ask ChatGPT is it's going to cite something that might be a little bit out of date. I've not really talked about this in the past, but I have written blog posts, so there's a link to a few blog posts there. And I think the key here is you can be very experienced but still a newcomer, which is absolutely fine. In fact, I think it's beneficial to the ecosystem and the community. So if you haven't spoke about it before, speak about it. We want to hear from you. Any questions?
It sounds like this is something you, along the road, realize, hey, we need to start modernizing our existing code base, but we were not refactoring from the start. What made you realize, hey, we need to start refactoring our code? Because your old CGI.pm scripts still works.
So the question is, why were we not refactoring from the continual refactoring, I guess? Why were we not doing that? So
We start to realize we need to do something with our legacy code base.
So when did the company realize we need to start modernizing and refactoring? Around the time that I joined. So around that time, so for the first 10 years, it was very much a get-to-market growth kind of approach. The development team was 3 people, and it got to 2012, 2013, where they realized we need to start thinking about the future and refactoring and modernizing. And so just over 10 years ago, I want to say, yeah.
Because it's a pretty interesting sell it to management. Hey, we need to go away for 2 years, and when we come back, our inside is better looking, but the outside still looks the same.
Yeah, it can be a hard sell to management. We are fortunate that at that time, management realized that we needed to, start fixing things, refactoring things, adding test coverage, modernizing. There was a lot of change around that time. Things got moved from an in-house hosted solution into AWS, and there was a lot happening. It wasn't just the Perl code, other things were changing as well.
When you said the ORM that you dropped down to SQL for the complicated stuff, is that SQL in the code, composed ORMs or views?
So when we drop down to vanilla SQL for some of the hairier reporting queries and all that kind of stuff, how do we do it? We tend to use virtual views. So DBIx has this concept of a virtual view, which is basically just a module with an SQL statement in it and some sugar around that. That's mostly the approach we do. I'd encourage you to watch the using a legacy schema with DBIx, where I go into a lot more detail around that, basically. Do we have time for any more questions there? Yeah, any more questions? No? Okay, thanks very much.